Having covered verses 16 through 20 in the previous appendix to the Daniel 11 hypothesis, which had to do with the League of Nations in verses 16 through 19 and the United Nations in verse 20, we come now to Appendix 5 in verses 13 through 15, which in my opinion began with Russia's entry into Syria on September 30th, 2015, and continue up until the woe of the fifth trumpet, coinciding with Daniel chapter 11 verse 20 and the breaking of the great horn of the he-goat, which is the same thing as the destruction of the one who sends a raiser of taxes in Daniel chapter 11 verse 20, with Daniel 11:21 being when the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins at the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels are cast to earth. But going back to September 30th, 2015, the king of the north shall return, the Russian Federation being the third king of the north, with the United States being the third king of the south. Jacob and Esau fought together from the womb, literally, as you can see in Genesis 25. So when the king of the north entered into Syria, there's been increasing tension ever since, perpetuated mainly by the hidden dynasty of education on both sides, the propaganda being electronically transmitted throughout the world. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south, the United States that is to say, and this will escalate now, especially with the U.S. cutting funding to the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic, even though it's really a plague of the mind by way of deception more than anything else. But regardless, many will stand up against the United States again, and cutting funding to the World Health Organization is also another step toward breaking the great horn of the he-goat, which is the United Nations. That's the strategy laid out on the last page of the grand chessboard also, as well as perpetuating America's own dominant position. The Federal Reserve can print dollars out of thin air, which is the global reserve currency. So there you have the hidden dynasty of economics, and a global economic crash would then basically reset Bretton Woods, pushing any competition back to square one. Remember, Russia, China, and Iran were talking about ditching the dollar in the past several years. That's now basically impossible. Also, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision of a new world order, that is to say, but they shall fall. And if you look up that word in the Hebrew, in this case it means to fail. There will be no one world political system until the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels are cast to earth. Daniel's fourth beast is exclusively supernatural, and it's only when the great horn of the he-goat is broken, so to speak, that the four notable ones you can read of in Daniel chapter 8 verse 8 rise up together at the same time in the so-called New World Order, beginning Revelation chapter 13, the four notable ones being the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7. So you'll see the robbers of thy people, which is what the he-goat symbolizes, attempt to bring the one world system into being, but they shall fail. You can already see the United Nations attempting it on its own by calling for 10% of the world's GDP to build itself back up economically, but they shall fail. And for an overview of the continuous weakening of the United Nations, this article from Foreign Policy titled "Trump Stealthily Seeks to Choke Off Funding to UN Programs" will give you an idea of what happened up to October 2018 with the continuous weakening or breaking of the United Nations. More recently, Trump pulled the United States out of the UN Arms Treaty, and again, cutting funding to the World Health Organization is part of the breaking of the great horn of the he-goat, because it's part of the United Nations. And once it's finally broken, so to speak, is when the dragon will stand on the sand of the sea, as Revelation chapter 13 verse 1 should read, the dragon being that old serpent called the devil and Satan. So then it's common sense that he would have to be cast to earth before the one world system can emerge, and his angels will be cast out with him, as it's written in Revelation chapter 12 verse 9. And according to Newsweek, on April 12th, Russia said the world no longer trusts the U.S. to lead. It's time for others to step in to stop blackmail and pressure. So there again, many shall stand up against the king of the south, which is the United States, Russia being the king of the north, who is also at this time putting together the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy, including Red China, no doubt, and that's the confederacy that will become the bear of Daniel chapter 7 at the woe of the fifth trumpet, when the he-goat becomes the leopard and Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh become the lion, the fourth king of the south of Daniel chapter 11, and the three horns, which are symbolic of the Christian nations of the world up until they're plucked up by the roots at 666 when Satan appears as Antichrist, which is in verse 31 of Daniel chapter 11. They're no longer Christian nations from that point forward, because they'll begin worshiping the devil instead of Christ, which is what Antichrist means, instead of Christ. So going back to verse 15 of Daniel chapter 11, the arms of the south shall not withstand, meaning the global political system that shall emerge at the woe of the fifth trumpet cannot be stopped, no matter which chosen chosen people, so to speak, which means elected officials are voted into power. After the great horn of the he-goat is broken, the woe of the fifth trumpet occurs when the so-called New World Order rises up out of the sea, so to speak, which is symbolic of peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. The great horn of the he-goat being the same thing as the one who sends a raiser of taxes in Daniel chapter 11, verse 20. The United Nations, in my opinion. And once that's broken, so to speak, the dragon, who is called the vile person in Daniel chapter 11, verse 21, will give the New World Order its power and seat and great authority, as you can see in Revelation chapter 13, when he confirms the covenant with many for 1 week, which was 7 years, but has now been shortened to 5 months. And after the deadly wound written of in Revelation 13, Satan appears as Antichrist at 666, the desolator, as you can see in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31 also, beginning the woe of the sixth trumpet. Then the last 5 verses of Daniel chapter 11 cover what happens when the true Christ returns at the woe of the seventh trumpet, when the battles of Armageddon and Hamon-Gog transpire and the day of the Lord begins, and the true Christ returns at that time as King of Kings and Lord of Lords.